Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Massey Hatch. I'm an air quality specialist with MS Hatch Consulting. Welcome to the SAME Environmental Community of Interest webinar. What's up with PFAS in air? Thank you so much for being here. We're thrilled with the turnout that we received for this webinar. We've had 90 people signing up for this webinar, which really speaks to how important this topic is. Before we get going, I wanted to go over some housekeeping points. If you are connecting through a VPN, you will most likely have some problems. So please try a different way of connecting. Don't go through VPN. Your audio is broadcast through the computer speakers. When you connected, you were prompted to connect to the audio stream. So click connect, and turn up your volume. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function and then look at the private tab for responses to your issue. And don't forget to submit your questions using the Q&A tab and do the upvote for the questions instead of repeating the same question. That'll help us quite a bit. And also remember that this webinar is being recorded for future use. Now to the main feature. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Kanan Patel-Coleman. Dr. Patel-Coleman is a senior risk assessor with Burns & McDonnell. She has over 30 years of experience performing human risk assessments, vapor intrusion investigations, environmental and ecological assessments, and various project and program management. Her clients range from military installations, facilities, government agencies, hospitals, and regulators. She participated on the first ASTM team developing national guidance for vapor intrusion investigations. Currently, she's a contributor to the ITRC PFAS team on the regulations, toxicity, and risk assessment subteam. She received her graduate degrees from UCLA, a master's in public health, and a doctorate in environmental science and engineering. Kanan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Massey, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining in this afternoon. For my presentation today, I pulled together material from different sources, public sites, work that I'm doing with ITRC, PFAS team, literature sources, and conversations with experts. And I want to say, what's up with PFAS in air? I think it's an up-and-coming topic. There's been a lot of conversation, discussion, work, effort addressing PFAS chemical contamination in our environment. And today we're going to be talking about the air component of that. I wanted to say too that as many of you know, the science and policy surrounding PFAS chemical management, treatment control is really fast moving. And so the things I say today are just a reflection of today. I'll be going over observations that I've made and where I think it's going, and then we'll see what happens. All right, so the key topics I'm going to try and cover in this hour or 45 minutes or so are sources of PFAS in air sampling and measurement, exposure and toxicity, which is a big component, and regulatory developments. But before I get started with that, I'm just going to do a quick review of PFAS and what PFAS are. It stands for, the acronym stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These chemicals began to be manufactured in the United States in the 1940s, so they've been around a long time. They have been really useful and valuable because they are water resistant, stain resistant, and oil resistant. So lots of uses for them. There are thousands of PFAS chemicals, which kind of makes it a really unwieldy class of chemicals to manage. And then because there's such a wide range. There's also a wide range of physical and chemical properties and how they behave. So trying to get our arms around the whole class is a daunting challenge. PFAS have been used in many different products. One of the most common ones, aqueous film-forming foam, otherwise known as AFFF. It was used in, and still is used sometimes in firefighting foam. It was an excellent substance for putting out fires. And so if you think about it, it was used anywhere where there's firefighting training or firefighting activities, whether in urban environments or at airports, at military facilities. So quite a wide range. It's used in Teflon and Scotchgard, common products. In the electronics industry, it's used as a surfactant and additive in manufacturing, metal plating, textiles, and paper surface treatment. So if you think about all those fabrics, carpet or stain-resistant carpet or flame-retardant fabrics, whether it's drapes or clothing. And then finally, it's last on my list, food handling, but it actually turns out that food products and food packaging, food handling contributes the most to the body burden of PFAS. And then with such widespread use in so many products and manufacturing of these products, you can imagine there's been dispersion throughout the environment. This figure comes from the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, and I thought it did an excellent job of trying to capture sources and movement of PFAS throughout our environment. Let's see. Okay, I lost my pointer button. If you look at the upper left corner, you see a factory-style building with smoke coming out of a stack, and that kind of represents the chemical manufacturing or product manufacturing of products using PFAS or incorporating PFAS. So that's a source. There are discharges that could go to wastewater discharge to streams, to groundwater, to treatment plants. And as you work your way across the slide to the right, you can see groundwater impacts, soils impacting even plant uptake, food supply, and drinking water to homes and offices. But the part that we're going to be trying to address in this presentation is at the top, where you have the air emissions coming out of the factory, transporting. There are some missing lines on here, for example, from landfill. There is some evidence that as we dispose of products containing PFAS into the landfills, they're there. So the chemicals are there in leachate and in possibly air emissions, and then also in the indoor air environments. The slide was just published a couple months ago in The Guardian, and it was their way of depicting an EPA report that found more than 120,000 facilities around the country that had PFAS releases and represent potential sites that and releases where people could be exposed. So it just highlights kind of the ubiquitous nature of PFAS and why it's such a concern. So it's prevalent. This is another one. This was taken from a Rhode Island news source, and it is a graphic displaying a report by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration on PFAS in foods. So the slide might be a little hard to read, but there are, let's see here. Yeah, in catfish, chicken, shrimp, salmon, etc., fruits and vegetables. And by the way, the dots next to the labels and the size of the dot represents the relative contribution of PFAS in that food product. And so I was startled by this big fat black dot in the lower right corner for iced chocolate cake with a whopping 17,640 parts per trillion of PFAS. And it made me seriously rethink that deliciously decadent chocolate cake I had at the last SAME Federal BizOps meeting a week and a half ago. I should have opted for the cheesecake instead. So I'm not going to go a lot into PFAS chemistry, but again, this is just to kind of get us up to speed for the main topic. But the basic chemistry, as I mentioned, the class of compounds consists of perfluoroalkyl substances and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Per meaning that each of the carbons in the chain are bonded with fluorine. So terminal carbons have 3 bonding sites, and so they're all filled with fluorine and so forth. With polyfluoroalkyl substances, most of the carbons are bonded with fluorine, but in this case, they're for fluorotelomere alcohols, the 2 of the carbons are not fully bonded with fluorine. So the first one of the perfluoroalkyl substances, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. That's the one that people refer to as PFAS. And then the next one, perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA. So those 2 have been studied the most, and a lot of the literature, the studies, the regulatory limits, the toxicity studies revolve around these 2 chemicals in particular. There are, just as a note, there are also branched perfluoroalkyl substances. And again, why do we care about these chemicals? Well, not only are they pervasive throughout our environment, but they are also they've been implicated in toxic effects. The toxic effects are typically determined through animal studies and or human studies, and here I'm just presenting evidence that's been obtained from human epidemiological studies. And there have been demonstrations of impacts to just a range of human systems, the liver with high cholesterol levels, the immune system, decreased vaccine response in children, developmental with lower birth weight, endocrine impacts with thyroid disease, reproductive impacts with decreased fertility, cardiovascular effects with pregnancy-induced hypertension, and even the increased risk of cancer, potentially with testicular kidney cancer. So sources of PFAS in air, and I wanted to mention that when we're talking about PFAS in air, there are 2 components. One is the particulate component, where PFAS is absorbed onto fine particulates and dust, and also the gaseous phase or volatile component. So I'll be talking about both of those. First, in terms of outdoor air sources, one component of outdoor air sources are stack emissions, as we saw in that figure. Manufacturers, we've talked about, but also incineration. Incinerating PFAS waste was one method that was considered for destroying the PFAS and treating PFAS. But there was an EPA technical brief that was released last year and pointed out that there were really an incomplete understanding of what happens when PFAS are incinerated. It's not well understood. There were some studies that were conducted that showed that there weren't PFAS residuals in the emissions, but this brief says that it's really inconclusive. They're limited studies, and one of the key issues is that the reason it's incomplete is for a lack of measurement methods, going back to complex, huge class of compounds that some have hypothesized that it might even take multiple methods to be able to characterize a spectrum of the chemicals that are out there. Another source of outdoor source are waste management facilities. I mentioned the landfills before, wastewater treatment plants. Going back to this figure, there can be off-gassing from both of these that contribute to the air. So off-gassing, but also from the landfills, it could be particulate entrainment. And then other sources, I had mentioned the use in firefighting foam as an outdoor activity. There are outdoor products that are used, and it could also be as we start to try and clean up PFAS in soils and moving those soils around, the excavation and particulate entrainment from that, from construction activities, et cetera. So indoor air sources. The earlier human studies found, this was in the 1970s, actually started out with occupational exposures and found that there were high blood serum levels of PFAS in people that worked at manufacturing facilities where PFAS was being generated or used. And so that's definitely one consideration for indoor air and indoor air sources. Going back to the consumer products and the widespread use of those products and flame retardant fabrics, stain resistant carpeting, those can also be sources in indoor environments. And then this is an emerging question about vapors. What about volatile PFAS? Most of the PFAS compounds are non-volatile, and so a lot of the attention in terms of research and understanding of vapor and transport have focused on that mode of transport. But I'll talk about it soon. There is some evidence that there are PFAS that could be volatile, and if volatile and in conditions where vapor intrusion could be something that should be taken into account. I don't have a slide in here for vapor intrusion, but quickly, essentially what that means is when there are subsurface, below the ground surface sources of PFAS in soil or groundwater that partition into the vapor phase or the air spaces in the subsurface and then can migrate. And it's been shown that volatiles can migrate into buildings, enclosed spaces, and become a source of indoor air contamination and health implications for people that are exposed in those environments. Oh, I wanted to mention about a year ago, over a year ago, I wrote a blog on PFAS in air, and one of my colleagues who read it thought, oh, when I mentioned the possibility of vapor intrusion, he thought I was making it up because he hadn't heard anybody talking about it, hadn't heard a conversation about it, even though he was tracking PFAS. And so that was last year. This is this year. And this year, the Air and Waste Management Association, as part of their biannual specialty conference on vapor intrusion, had an entire session devoted to PFAS. It was called All Things PFAS. And I just want to acknowledge the bright and accomplished scientists that had wonderful presentations in this session. So people were talking about it. It just wasn't formalized in public settings, probably. So the presentations that were given on sampling and analysis by Taryn McKnight of Eurofins, vapor intrusion by Steve Zemba at Sanborn Haddon Associates, volatility by Julia Roth, vapor intrusion potential, the Geosyntec consultants. Travis and Chase actually gave those presentations, and then air emissions from water by Matthew Tracer at Ramble. So what about vapor intrusion? Is that real? I mean, can we really should be thinking about it in terms of PFAS? And so there have been a couple of thoughts on that subject. Steve Zemba presented Henry's Law constants. Henry's Law constant, that is essentially the ratio of a chemical in the air phase versus the liquid phase. And it's an indicator of how a chemical might behave in the environment. Will it favor being in the air environment versus the liquid phase? And so the table here summarizes some of the data that were presented, and I listed PFAS compounds. You'll recall these three: PFAS, PFOA, and FTOH. PFAS and PFOA are the most studied. FTOH is of interest because it's one of the groups of PFAS chemicals that might actually be volatile and might be a consideration. So to give you an indication, if we look at the Henry's Law constants of these compounds, they're similar to these other compounds that we might be more familiar with. So PFAS is like various pesticides, PFOA on the order of benzene, and FTOH with vinyl chloride. And so again, to give you an idea in terms of volatility, it would be low, medium, or high. And so the fluorotelomere alcohols, FTOH, could be a consideration for vapor intrusion. In Julia Roth's presentation, she also explored the evidence for volatility of PFAS compounds, and based her discussion on the US EPA definition of volatility, where the Henry's Law constant should be greater than 10 to the minus 5 atmosphere meters cubed per mole, and or the vapor pressure is greater than 1 millimeter mercury. And so with these criteria, FTOH, this particular species of it, does fit that definition. And in a background ambient air study, I thought this was really interesting, where daily samples were collected from an Arctic cruise, and then there were other samples from the city of Toronto. But in taking those samples and trying to get an idea of, one would expect the Arctic to be background, most of the PFAS measured in air were in the gaseous phase, and it was FTOH. So that kind of lends some evidence that there are vapor phase PFAS, and that they're measurable and persistent to a certain extent. So some of the issues and considerations when asking questions about the vapor intrusion potential of PFAS chemicals and certain chemicals are that, just going back to the limited amount of data that are available on physical and chemical properties of PFAS. They're also really complex in terms of the chemistry. The compounds have hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends, and so and it's highly dependent on pH, on temperature. So there's a lot of factors that go into how the chemicals can behave. Again, going back to there being thousands of compounds, and they can behave in a range of different ways. So we probably can't be thinking about PFAS as one group behaving one way. It's not going to be like that. There's just going to be a mixture. And then the other issue with FTOH actually being a precursor to PFOA. So then it raises questions, well, what about degradation? It degrades to this more stable, persistent form. So now it's not volatile anymore. So those are some of the things to balance out and think about. So going back to the issue that EPA raised about insufficient sampling methods, I'd like to thank Eurofins, particularly Taryn McKnight, Heidi Hayes, and Laura, sorry, I'm going to mess up your name, Renza, and then others at Eurofins that kind of gave me some information about what's happening in the analytical world. And the way I'm going to be organizing this section is there are, I guess I didn't have a slide for that, but air sampling and measurement, talking about source emissions. Think back to the factories and the smokestacks that are point source emissions. That's one aspect. Then there's outdoor air or ambient air, which could be just in the outdoor environment. It could also include indoor environments, but it's ambient air. And then the third category would be the soil vapor and potential for vapor intrusion. So for stack air sampling, this is a diagram that shows how what kind of sampling train is required to even collect particulates from a stack. And there are a number of considerations. One of the key aspects in measuring particulates is having isokinetic sampling, meaning that the samples have to be collected at the same flow rate as the air flowing through that stack, so that you're collecting a representative sample of what's actually in the air rather than skewed or biased because the particulates are depositing out or somehow not being captured. And then there are all these different parts to the sampling train, including the ice bath, the impingers, the receptacles. This is the XAD2 resin tube or the sorbent, where the air flows through and traps the PFAS. And then here's the breakthrough resin tube before it goes out for collection. So this is the particulate diagram, and then this is the sampling train for volatiles. It's with volatiles, you don't have to worry so much about that isokinetic sampling, and it's not as complicated, but there's still lots of parts to it. So it's something to think about when considering stack sampling, that that there are a lot of components to it, and it takes some expertise to be able to do this kind of sampling. And one of the other aspects is, again, with PFAS, what are the test methods? The current established test methods aren't really suitable for PFAS, and so EPA developed this method called the other test method, 45. It was first published at the beginning of this year, and it's still draft and under development. It's meant to evaluate emissions from stationary sources, and particularly semi-volatile particulate-bound PFAS. The samples can be used in either targeted or non-targeted analysis. Targeted meaning that there are known standards available and that we can analyze for those specific PFAS chemicals. Non-targeted meaning trying to identify PFAS that might be in the sample, but we don't have a standard necessarily or a profile for that chemical. OTM methods isn't the only one, but this mechanism that EPA has is a way of releasing a method basically that they feel is needed. And in this case, there weren't any other consistent valid methods to use. And so it's providing a framework that other regulatory agencies or parties can use while even though it hasn't yet gone through the rulemaking process, which is the federal rulemaking process is a process. It can take a while before something is actually approved and a method that can be used as an authoritative regulation. What they do say about this method, though, is that if another jurisdiction wants to approve it through state or local protocols, that they can do that. That it is considered suitable for that kind of regulatory use. So this slide mentions some of the things that had to be modified from existing air sampling methods that then the modifications had to be made for the PFAS chemicals. So for one thing, lower temperature collection. So recall the ice baths that the impingers had to be in order to collect the samples. And then using methanol as an extraction solvent instead of methylene chloride, and then a secondary resin trap. Let's see if I can go back to that. I think it's easier to see in this one. So that's this one, because if there's breakthrough of PFAS in here, then there's a second trap to collect it. I mentioned non-targeted analysis. This is an emerging technique or method, and it's to address this issue that there are standard methods only for some of the PFAS, and yet we have a whole large class of compounds to have to think about, and it's a way of being able to test for unknowns. Like suppose you have stack emissions and you might have used certain PFAS at the facility, or maybe not, or you just want to make sure that there's nothing coming out. And I'll talk about that in a moment too when I get to the regulatory environment about emissions testing. And you might not know what PFAS you would expect in your samples. And so it's a way of being able to do more of a sweep and capture information about PFAS in the samples that you don't know ahead of time. The non-targeted analysis, this particular one, a quadrupole mass spec combined with time of flight unit, is it provides a more comprehensive understanding of the sample than the target methods, as I just mentioned. But it does require technical expertise to interpret the output. There's the profile that's output. Some of it can be compared to known known profiles in a library, whereas others would need interpretation. This method is fast and it's sensitive. One of the things that really struck me are the low detection limits in femtograms, which is right now PFAS are measured in nanograms, and at least on the soil side, the regulatory limits are in nanograms, and this method actually provides those low detection limits and goes even lower. The downside is that it's very costly. So that was for source emissions. This part is talking about ambient air sample collection. Nothing too different here for PFAS. It's but what's more of a consideration with PFAS and using high volume sampling or low volume sampling is making sure that you don't have cross-contamination from other materials that you're using in the sampling. I mean, that's true also for any of these, but that's one of the things that needs to be taken into consideration. The high volume sampler you can pull through hundreds of meters cubed of air volume through that sampler. This one, the low volume sampler, is much smaller. The high volume could be a good one to use outdoors. And you see these are in an outdoor environment. Low volume could be used indoors, again, for ambient air, but in indoor or an enclosed space type of environment. The polyurethane and XAD cartridges that are used in these samplers The sorbent, Toxicity sorbent, is specific to PFAS, so that is something else that's specific for PFAS and using these methods. And then the analytical method that's being used right now is TO13A. And I didn't put it here, but I think this is also still in development. The method itself was originally developed for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And again, the main thing that's important is the preparation of the sampling and sample collection. It's analyzed by GCMS, and it can also achieve sub-nanogram levels in terms of detection limits. Okay, so soil vapor and indoor air. It's one thing to think about it from the science. Is it possible? And we have some evidence that it is possible that some of the PFAS could be volatile. So if that's the case, then that lends us to potential indoor air impacts through from the subsurface into the homes. And this is a picture, kind of a diagram showing that, like if you have a soil or a groundwater source or product down here, and there's a construction over it, enclosed space. This one's a home. It could be a commercial space as well, and the vapors coming off of that source and migrating through the floor, through cracks in the floor, and into the indoor space. But the question is, what about sampling? Like, it's one thing, how are we going to sample for it and analyze for it? So TO17 is a sorbent tube method that's already been established, but again, because of the nature of PFAS, there are modifications that need to be made. The sorbent material, for example, is, and this is something that I understand Eurofins is developing in conjunction with EPA to try and find out a method for being able to measure this. And in the end, it's being able to measure it will help us to know. I mean, we can take measurements in air, but one of the questions that came up is, okay, if you find even the FTOHs in indoor air, where is it coming from? Is it coming from the products that are already in that space, or are they coming up from contaminant sources subsurface? So without being able to measure the subsurface, we can't answer that question. So exposure and toxicity. Exposure pathways, again, a brief kind of explanation or primer. Exposure pathways are ways that, and I'm just going to be talking about human exposure right now. PFAS are released into the environment, and so essentially from the surface water, the groundwater, the soil, the air, wherever it is, whatever media it's in, how does it get to us, and how does it get into our bodies? So the typical routes of exposure are ingestion, dermal, and inhalation. Again, inhalation includes particulates and vapors, inhalation of air. And the media, the focus so far has been on water, which is kind of interesting because the initial studies showed impacts to workers in manufacturing facilities, but I think it started coming up in water testing and drinking water supplies, which is everywhere, and became a heightened concern. So from water, it moved to soil, and then naturally from soil, then biota and sediment. And so we're at the point now where, what about air? I don't really see this progression as necessarily being a surprise. Again, going back to the kind of a conceptual site model or PFAS cycle of how chemicals move through the environment. It sort of makes sense that we need to think about it at some point, and at least check the box and understand what the potential is there. In terms of the process, going back to exposure and media and even risk assessment, it's not there isn't anything particularly unique about doing evaluations of PFAS in terms of risk assessment compared to other chemical pathways. There are processes, methods, procedures for how to do those estimates and estimate the impact to potential health if people are exposed. But the main issue, and I'll be getting to that in a moment, is the toxicology. Here I listed a few PFAS studies that have been done in air, and there's one on textile manufacturing, study of air and dust, and they found that the PTOH exposure in air was 5 orders of magnitude greater than in background. So again, it supports kind of the fluorotelmer alcohols as being a real volatile PFAS consideration. Another study by Yiming et al. In China, they did indoor air and dust study, and again found PTOH was predominant in the air samples and in the dust samples. They went further and took these results and estimated daily intake rates, and they found that the intake from air inhalation, and what they mean by that is the volatile fraction, was greater than from particulates. And then a study in firefighters, this was just published last year, Pfas serum concentrations were 18 to 74% higher than in the general public. So again, this is an occupational exposure of the people that are actually working with AFFF. Also, they did a study comparing airport firefighters with urban or suburban firefighters, and they found that the airport firefighters had 21% to 62% higher concentrations and PFAS concentrations in blood serum than the suburban firefighters. Yeah, I wanted to mention there was also a study that just came out a couple months ago with PFAS and air study in kindergarten classrooms and home, in university offices, and found that and specifically the volatile concentrations were higher than what was found in carpet shops and in outdoor apparel shops. So it kind of points to potentially indoor air being a greater issue than previously thought. So PFAS toxicity, the toxicity criteria that have been established so far for PFAS chemicals have been based on ingestion. And so the ingestion and direct contact through dermal contact as well. So the criteria have not really been developed for inhalation exposures, which is a completely different route and mechanism. There's that issue. We don't have toxicity criteria developed yet for inhalation exposures. Toxicity criteria are important because they go into the calculation for evaluating risks if people are exposed to PFAS, and indicate obviously the level of toxicity of a particular compound. And some of the issues is that there's a high variability in setting toxicity criteria, critical effects study, health effect endpoint, or uncertainty factors. These are professional judgment calls, and they can vary from person to person, whoever's working on it and looking at the literature. This is an example of variability where US EPA came up with a PFOA and PFAS levels and this is dose levels, but or intake, I'm sorry, intake levels, but they were based on different studies than what ATSDR used. So EPA came up with 20 nanograms per kilogram per body weight per day for PFOA, whereas ATSDR came up with 3 and then 20 and 2. So an order of magnitude difference. And it's just based on the endpoints that were the studies that were selected, the endpoints, and then ATSDR added a 10-fold uncertainty factor to account for immunotoxicity. So all this, it's like if there's all that variability and you've seen it in a wide range of levels set by states for soils, how much more so for inhalation? The path forward is there is an approach using root-to-root extrapolation where you can take the toxicity criteria established for ingestion and modify them for inhalation toxicity. But there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. And I wanted to mention I'm on the ITRC PFAS team. They, in fact, the call was just before this one. And I'm on the regulatory toxicity and risk assessment sub-team. Some of the content that we're thinking about developing in the next 2 years is will include, it's on the table for discussion, but could include inhalation toxicology and addressing the state of science and policy for regulating PFAS in the air. So definitely something coming up on the horizon. Maybe that should fall under regulatory developments. So the National Defense Authorization Act, this was from 2020. This act said that all incineration must be conducted in accordance with the Clean Air Act, which requires stack emissions be permitted, which implies there needs to be standards and measurement methods available. For 2022, this is coming up in this next fiscal year, in this next year, the NDAA is putting a moratorium on PFAS and AFFF incineration by DoD. They're putting a halt to it. And this ties back to what I said earlier about the uncertainty related with incineration of PFAS. And, we just don't know what's coming out. It also requires that PFAS emissions control standard operating practices be established, and that cleanup goals in any media have to, and this is for Department of Defense sites, that they have to be based on the most stringent of state or federal CERCLA standards. Toxic Substances Control Act. This authorizes EPA to regulate chemicals that could be harmful to human health or the environment, and they use a mechanism of significant new use rule, amongst other things. But this puts restrictions on chemicals or significant new uses. And in 2020, a SNR was promulgated that prohibits importing carpets with perfluoroalkyl sulfonate chemicals without EPA review. And then this year, EPA in 2021, with the new administration, has done a lot of activity on the PFAS front. They released a strategic roadmap, and they have a 3-year plan of action, actually 4 years. And the very first paragraph talks about PFAS in air. So it's air, water, and land. So definitely air is a part of that roadmap. There are 3 key directives: research on, again, the toxicity, that's key, restricting a comprehensive approach to prevent PFAS in air, land, and water, and to broaden and accelerate cleanup, holding polluters accountable. When I hear that, that sounds to me like regulation. They established a EPA Council on PFAS. A council that is going to be focused on PFAS, scientific advisory board, other things. Key action, one of their key actions, this was released think about a month ago or a couple months ago. But I pasted the whole thing here. Build technical foundation, address PFAS emissions to identify sources, develop and finalize monitoring approaches for stack emissions. We talked about stack emissions. We talked about ambient air. Develop information on cost-effective mitigation technologies. I haven't talked about that here, but that's part of the plan. And fate and transport of PFAS air emissions. This is expected not for a year and then ongoing after that. I'm running short on time, but I just want to mention that various states have already established PFAS air standards, either as screening levels or as regulatory levels, Michigan, New Hampshire, Texas. But the key, and this comes from the Environmental Council of States, which is kind of the parent organization to ITRC. And it was based on a state survey. And one of the questions they asked the states is, what are your key questions in moving forward with PFAS regulation? And the top one listed was how to develop PFAS guidelines and less explored media, such as air emissions. There were other items as well as food and biota, but air was definitely there. What's ahead? Where are we going? Well, based on what I just presented, it looks like source emissions, permitting requirements are probably coming, ambient air monitoring, possibly indoor air quality, definitely a concern as more and more studies are coming out showing high levels of, or at least PFAS detections comparable to maybe not manufacturing, but like the stores, so high levels, vapor intrusion potential. So all of this driven by more robust regulatory frameworks, especially for the next few years. So thank you very much for joining in, and we're open for questions now.
Kanan, thank you so much for the great presentation and very, very informative. Before we get to Q&A, we have actually about 9 minutes and we have quite a few questions, but I'm going to ask everyone to just take 1 second, go to the polls tab and just do a quick poll so we know who is at the webinar. Thank you so much for doing that. And all right, Kanan, do you know why Oklahoma and Colorado are states with such highest rates of exposure? And it looks like Southern California is pretty high too.
Yes. No, actually, I don't know. I apologize.
Yeah, maybe we can get back to that question later. Another question is, has EPA approved of the modified PM and modified method for VOC stack testing? Actually, and then there's a second part. There's actually 3 parts. Are stack testers, the companies, are they up to speed on those requirements, and what's the approximate cost?
Yeah, so the methods, particularly for VOCs, are in development. So there's nothing that's approved or, when I say approved, what that means, like when EPA comes out with methods, they become regulatory methods that, can be defended in court kind of thing. So no, there isn't anything like that yet. Like it's in development. In terms of the sampling trains, I understand that there are a few companies that do have that capability. They do know how to set up that sampling train. It's not, I don't think it's different from what's already done for sampling for other kinds of chemicals. So the main issue is that team or that company being aware of the unique considerations of PFAS so they don't introduce cross-contamination.
And do you know about any approximate cost of sampling?
Oh, well, I can't give a dollar value, but if you'd like, I can recommend someone that you could talk to. I mean, Fins is certainly a company that can be contacted.
Great, thank you. Next,
that information.
yes. Thanks, Kanan. Next question is there a reason why airport firefighters have a higher PFAS serum concentration relative to suburban firefighters?
My thought was that it could be just that it's used more often and in larger quantities because of the nature of airport fires and the potential.
Thank you. Another question has to do with the NDAA. Does the 2020 Act include previously operating stack emissions under testing standards, or do those emission testing standards only apply to newly operating stacks?
I don't think it, or I'm not aware of a differentiation, but my thought is that it would not just be for new, because it's PFAS is a new class of chemicals, so it's understanding what's coming out now. The NDAA in setting those limits, it's going to be for what's existing to understand something that had never been measured before.
All right. Thank you so much. I think there's one more question. For PFAS compounds with a high Henry's law constant, you mentioned that FTOH is a precursor of PFOA. Are there any other high volatile PFAS compounds that are precursors of PFOS?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I do want to point out that when we talk about PTOH, it's also a group. So it's not just one chemical, but a group of chemicals that have certain common characteristics. So that it's called, that's why they're called fluorotelomere alcohols. So it's a group, and it's understanding, what that group of volatile chemicals are and how they migrate through the environment. These are
Thank you.
great questions, and I was just going to say, really awesome questions. I apologize that I don't have a depth of expertise in all of these areas. My goal here was to present a broad, kind of a high-level overview of what information is out there and where things might be going. But I'd be happy to help point people in a direction if they need more information and share the sources that I've had that I've consulted.
Yeah, it would be good if it's possible to get a list of these questions and people who presented the questions. So, Kanan, maybe you can get back to them separately down the road. So we'll look into that. But one more question came in. Has the PFAS data for the California wastewater plants that have to be tested been shared with the air districts or for offsite exposures? Or is it way too early for that? Do we know if the air districts have that data?
Yeah, I don't know about that specifically for California wastewater plants, but that's a good question. My thought is that, yeah, it's going to be coming, as people start thinking about PFAS in air and where it's coming from, then the attention will go in that direction. I think most of the sources are probably going to be coming from the manufacturing sector, just in terms of quantity. But yeah, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, other potential air sources will probably get highlighted.
Yeah, at least in San Diego, I haven't heard a reference from the air district to any of that PFAS data from wastewater treatment plants. I think that's all the questions we have. I want to thank Kanan again for presenting today and Thank you all for being here today. We had 80 people at the webinar, so great turnout, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.